The day Cora Abbott buried her husband with nothing but a rusted shovel and her own 2 hands was the same day she decided she would never ask another living soul for help again. The earth of Redemption Creek, Texas was hard in September of 1878, packed and unforgiving as the circumstances that had brought her to it, and she drove that shovel into the red dirt with every last ounce of fury and grief and terrifying calm she possessed. The sun beat down without mercy. The dry grass rattled in a wind that smelled of distant rain. The wooden cross she fashioned afterward was crooked, knocked together from fence posts, and she stood before it for a long moment with her hands bleeding and her back straight, and her face tilted up toward the sky as though daring God himself to comment on the quality of her work. Thomas Abbott had been many things. A dreamer, first and foremost. A man who believed land could be tamed, and futures could be built from nothing and hard work alone was the currency that mattered most. He had brought Cora out to the Texas Hill Country 3 years prior with a wagon full of promises, and a deed to 40 acres that nobody else had wanted because the well was questionable, and the soil was rocky, and the nearest town was a half-day's ride over uneven terrain. He had died of a fever on a Tuesday, quietly and without drama, and in that way he had been consistent with who he had always been. A man who did everything with a kind of earnest, uncomplicated effort that Cora had loved even as she sometimes wished he'd been more of a fighter. She was 26 years old, widowed, and alone on 40 acres in the Texas Hill Country in the autumn of 1878, and the world was under no particular obligation to care about any of that. She walked back to the house, a 2-room structure of rough-hewn timber and limestone rock that Thomas had built the first summer with more enthusiasm than skill. And she sat at the kitchen table, and she allowed herself exactly 1 hour of grief. She counted the minutes by the angle of light through the window. She let herself cry without making a sound, because sound felt wasteful and she had nothing left to waste. Then she stood up, washed her face in the basin, and began making a list of everything that needed doing before winter. The list was long. The fence on the north pasture had been failing since spring, and she had 2 mares and a mule that had to be contained. The roof over the sleeping room leaked at the eastern corner, which meant laying in fresh mud plaster before the rains came in earnest. The vegetable garden needed harvesting, and the root cellar needed stocking, and the wood pile needed to be doubled in size at minimum. The well, always questionable, had dropped another foot during the summer drought and would need tending. She had enough flour and salt and dried beans to last through December if she was careful. She had a rifle and a decent supply of ammunition. She had her hands and her mind and the stubborn, particular kind of courage that does not announce itself, but simply gets up every morning and proceeds. 3 weeks after Thomas died, the man from the bank rode out from Redemption Creek. His name was Mr. Harlan Voss, and he was not, by any reasonable measure, a villain. He was simply a practical man doing a practical job in a time and place that had no patience for sentiment. He was perhaps 50 years old, soft-bellied, with the permanently worried expression of someone who had spent too long dealing with other people's financial difficulties. He dismounted at the fence line and removed his hat and told Cora that the land note Thomas had taken out against the property was coming due in the spring, that there was the matter of back interest that had accumulated, and that the bank would need either payment or, he paused here, had the decency to look uncomfortable, some resolution of the situation. The situation, Cora said, being that I am a widow with a mortgage. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. How much? She said. Toll. Interest included. He told her. It was not a catastrophic sum, but it was well beyond what she currently possessed. She thanked him, did not offer him water though she had it to give, and watched him ride back toward town with the expression of a woman who has just received information she already knew was coming. She went back inside and added one more item to her list. She spent October and November working the land with a ferocity that surprised even herself. She harvested every last vegetable from the garden. She traded surplus beans and preserved tomatoes at the general store in Redemption Creek for cash money. She took in mending work from 3 families in town, riding in twice a week to collect and deliver, the rhythm of needle and thread filling her evenings by lantern light while her eyes ached and her fingers went numb. She broke the south field herself, walking behind the mule with a borrowed plow, and planted winter wheat in rows so straight they looked almost proud. She learned things that women of her particular background and generation were not generally expected to know. She learned to doctor a horse's thrown shoe, a skill she acquired through necessity and a great deal of cursing. She learned to read the sky the way the old-timers in town read it, the particular shade of yellow-green that meant a bad storm was coming across the plains, the way the air pressure dropped against the skin before a blue norther swept down from the panhandle. She learned to be alone with herself and not flinch from it. The nights were the hardest part, not because she was frightened, though there were moments, a sound at the edge of the property, a shadow that moved when it shouldn't. Not because she missed Thomas with a particular torment, though she missed him steadily, the way you miss water when you're thirsty rather than the way you miss it when you're drowning. The nights were hardest because they were long and she was her own only company, and there was no one to tell about the small victories of the day, no one to witness the evidence of her own endurance. She told no one how hard it was. She told no one because there was no one to tell, and because she would not have done so anyway. Redemption Creek in 1878 was a town of perhaps 300 souls, which in Texas Hill Country qualified it as a proper settlement. It had a main street of packed earth and 6 storefronts, and a church and a livery, and a saloon called the Dusty Star that was louder on Saturday nights than propriety strictly permitted. It had a sheriff named Earl Briggs who was decent enough, and a schoolteacher named Miss Farnworth who was fierce about education, and a doctor named Hawthorne who had trained in St. Louis and regarded Texas with a combination of professional dedication and perpetual exasperation. It also had Cecil Cooper. Cecil Cooper had arrived in Redemption Creek in the spring of 1878, approximately 4 months before Thomas Abbott died, and had purchased the rundown livery at the south end of Main Street from its previous owner, who had been on his way to California and not looking back. Cecil was 31 years old, which meant he had grown up in the years just following the war and carried in him the particular character of a generation that had watched the world break and had had to decide, early and with insufficient guidance, what to put in its place. He was not a showy man. He was tall in the way that suggests efficiency rather than imposingness, with dark brown hair that was perpetually in need of a cut and a face that was angular and weathered from years of outdoor work, and honest in the way that faces can be honest, where you look at someone and understand immediately that what you see is what you get. His hands were a working man's hands, scarred and capable. He had a quality of stillness about him that was not quietness exactly, but rather a kind of concentrated attention, the sense that when he looked at something he was really looking, not just casting his eyes in its direction. He had come from East Texas, from a small community near Nacogdoches, and he had learned everything he knew about horses and iron and practical enterprise from his father, who had been a blacksmith, and his own 2 decades of hard experience. He had no family in Redemption Creek and no particular plan beyond the livery, and he kept to himself with the comfortable self-sufficiency of a man who had long ago made peace with his own company. He was also, and this would matter, a man who noticed things. He noticed, for example, that Cora Abbott came into Redemption Creek twice a week on an old buckskin mare that was a good horse, but badly needed her back shoes attended to. He noticed this because horses were his business, and he noticed all horses, but he noticed it more than he might have because the woman riding the buckskin had something about her that was hard to look away from. It was not precisely beauty, though she was handsome in a direct, an unadorned way, dark hair pulled back without ceremony, gray eyes that swept a room or a street with the same efficient assessing quality as a woman who had learned to evaluate situations quickly and act accordingly. It was something else, something that had to do with the way she carried herself, the way she moved through space as though every step was deliberate and every action had been considered and cost accounted for. He noticed she was alone. He noticed the mending in the saddlebags. He noticed the way she conducted her business in town, efficient, polite, stripped of any unnecessary interaction, and he noticed how, when she had finished, she sat on her mare for just a moment at the edge of town before turning for home, and in that moment something passed across her face that was gone so quickly you might have thought you'd imagined it. Cecil Cooper was not a man who made assumptions. He filed what he noticed away and said nothing. The first time they spoke properly was in early December, and it happened because of a horse. Cora's buckskin mare had thrown a shoe on the road into town and was walking uneven, and Cora had led her the last quarter-mile on foot rather than push the animal further. She came into town dusty and controlled, the mare's reins in her hand, and she stopped in front of the livery because that was the logical place to stop. Cecil was in the yard replacing a wheel spoke on a wagon when she walked up. He looked at the horse first, which Cora noted and respected. He stood and dusted his hands on his trousers and said, "Rear left, she confirmed. "How did you know? The way she's carrying her weight." "Been watching you ride in on her a few months now, and she's been overdue for shoeing. I should have said something." Cora looked at him. "Why didn't you?" "Didn't know if you'd want me to." It was such a direct and honest answer that it stopped her for a moment. Most men in town, when they wanted to offer Cora something, phrased it in a way that required her to feel grateful. He had simply told her the truth of his hesitation. "I would have," she said, "wanted you to." He nodded, took the mare's reins with a gentle confidence that the horse responded to immediately, and led her into the livery. Cora followed. She stood in the cool dimness of the stable and watched him work, watched the economy of his movements as he inspected all four hooves in turn, the focused quiet he brought to it, and she thought that she had been in this town for 3 years and somehow never properly looked at this man. "Cecil Cooper," he said, without turning from the hoof he was examining. "Cora Abbott," she said, "I know who you are. You bought the Prentice livery." "I did." He looked up at her then. "I know who you are too." "I was sorry to hear about your husband." "Thank you," she said, with the practiced ease of someone who has received condolences so many times they have become their own kind of armor. Then, surprising herself slightly, "He would have liked you. He liked men who knew what they were doing." Cecil was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I'll have her ready in an hour, no charge." "I pay my debts," Cora said immediately. "It's not a debt, it's a courtesy." "I don't, Mrs. Abbott." He said it calmly, not unkindly. "Let me do something kind without it costing you anything. Surely the world has not gotten so small that a man can't shoe a horse for a neighbor." She looked at him for a long moment with those assessing gray eyes, and something in her, some tightly wound spring of self-sufficiency, loosened exactly one turn. "An hour," she said. "I'll be at the general store." She came back in 55 minutes, which he thought said something worth knowing, and the mare was ready and shod properly on all four hooves, which said something about him, and they stood in the late December light outside the livery, and Cora looked at the neat, solid work and then looked at him and said simply, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said. "Ride safe." She rode safe, and she thought about him for 3 days afterward, which irritated her somewhat because she had a list and he was not on it. January came down hard on the Texas hill country. The blue northers that swept through the region in winter were not quite blizzards, but they were cold and fierce, and the wind cut like a poorly aimed knife, with great enthusiasm and some personal damage. Cora had laid in enough wood and enough food, and she got through the cold stretches with the combination of physical preparedness and mental stubbornness that had become her signature response to difficulty. She was in town on a Wednesday in late January when she overheard 2 men at the general store talking about the Whitmore property, which was south of Redemption Creek, and had recently been bought up by a man named Garrett who was expanding his cattle holdings and had been, according to the conversation, approaching several of the smaller landowners in the area with offers to purchase. Not aggressive offers, polite ones, but the kind of polite that has the weight of money behind it, which tends to be more persistent than any amount of aggression. She filed this information away the way she filed most information, quietly, completely, without visible reaction, and thought about it on the ride home. The following week she encountered Cecil Cooper again, and this time it was not about a horse. She was at the general store collecting her mending work, and he was there purchasing provisions, flour, coffee, a jar of molasses. And they were the only two customers at that moment, and Mrs. Hensley behind the counter excused herself to attend to something in the back room. And suddenly, they were just two people standing among the smells of cured tobacco and dried goods in the gray winter light coming through the store window. "You've been thinking about something," he said, which was an unusual thing to say to someone who was, as far as he could observe, simply standing at a counter. "Most people are thinking about something most of the time," she said. "Not the way you are. You've got a particular look." She turned to him more fully then. "And what look is that, Mr. Cooper?" "The look of someone who's working out a problem and not finding the solution yet." She studied him for a moment. The light from the window was pale and clean, and he was looking at her with that steady, unhurried attention, and she felt it again, that thing she'd felt in the livery. Not discomfort, something closer to its opposite. "Garrett's people have been buying up small holdings south of town," she said. "I imagine they'll be coming north next." "I imagine so too," he said. "Have they approached you?" "Not yet, but my land note is coming due in spring, and everyone in the county knows it because Harlan Voss cannot keep private business private." She said this without heat, as a statement of fact. "When they do approach me, I'll need to have an answer ready." "The answer being no." "Answer being that I intend to keep my land," she said, and there was a quiet ferocity in it that he recognized the way you recognize fire, not as something dangerous but as something real, something that generates actual heat, something that has the capacity to warm you if you are standing at the right distance. "Then you'll need to clear the note before they can apply pressure through the bank," he said. "Do you have a plan for that?" She hesitated. "Not long," but he noticed. "I'm working on one," she said. Cecil bought his provisions, and they walked out of the store together into the cold, clear January air and stood for a moment on the porch, and he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I'd like you to hear it plain without it getting your back up." She looked at him sideways. "That's an interesting preamble. The south half of my livery yard is sitting empty. I've been thinking about taking in horses to board. There are 3 or 4 ranches in the area whose operation would benefit from it, but I don't have the help to manage it properly and keep the shoeing work going at the same time." He paused. "You know horses. I've watched you with yours. And I know you ride out twice a week for mending work because I see you go past." Cora said nothing, waiting for the shape of what he was saying. "I'm not offering charity," he said directly, heading off whatever response she was preparing. "I'm offering a business arrangement. You help manage the boarding side, exercise and groom the horses, keep the accounts. I know you can keep accounts because Mrs. Hensley told me you do her ledger, and I pay you a fair wage. A proper one. Enough to put something significant toward your land note by spring." The silence that followed was occupied by wind along the street and the distant sound of someone hammering at the blacksmith's. "Why?" she said. "Because I need the help and you need the work, and neither of us is the kind of person who makes this kind of thing harder than it needs to be." She looked at him for a long moment. The winter light was brutal in its honesty, and he did not look away from it, did not look away from her. "I'll start Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed, and she thought she saw something in his expression shift, something that was almost relief but more than relief, something closer to satisfaction, the look of a man who has asked for exactly what he wanted and is not accustomed to it working out that well. She rode home through the cold with the mending saddlebags and something else she did not quite have a name for, a tentative, cautious warmth, no bigger than a match flame, which she told herself was simply the prospect of financial stability and had nothing whatsoever to do with the man who had offered it. She did not entirely believe herself. She began work at the livery on the first Monday of February 1879, riding in before dawn and arriving, while the air was still iron cold, and the sky was the deep blue of early morning before the sun has truly committed to rising. The livery was warm with horse breath and hay smell and the low, reassuring sounds of large animals beginning their day, and Cecil was already there, working by lantern light, and he nodded when she came in with the calm ease of someone who has been expecting exactly what has arrived. They worked well together from the first day in a way that surprised Cora more than she would have admitted. She had worked alongside Thomas, of course, but Thomas had been her husband, and the working together had been naturally embedded in the larger structure of their life. Working alongside someone who was not that, someone who was simply a man she knew slightly and trusted provisionally, was a different experience entirely. Cecil Cooper, she discovered, had a way of occupying space that did not crowd other people. He was thorough and methodical, and he had opinions about how things should be done, but he held those opinions without attachment, meaning that if Cora had a better way of doing something, he would observe it and adjust with no more drama than if he had thought of it himself. He did not explain things she had not asked to have explained. He did not check on her work unnecessarily. He did not treat her with the particular kind of helpful hovering that is actually condescension wearing a friendly face. What he did do was talk to her, not excessively, not to fill silence for silence's own sake, but in the natural way that two people working together in close quarters begin to share the small substance of themselves observations about the horses, the weather, the state of the road, the news from town, and gradually, as February moved toward March, those conversations began to carry more weight. She learned that he had a younger sister in Nacogdoches married to a schoolteacher, and he worried about her privately, and said so plainly when the topic came up, which she appreciated. She learned that he had been to Kansas City once, years ago, and found it bewildering in a way that he described with such precise self-awareness that she laughed. The first real laugh she could remember in a very long time, sharp and genuine, and slightly startling to them both. He learned that Cora had grown up in Tennessee, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, that she had learned to read before most of the other children in her town, and had never stopped, that she kept books in the house despite everything and read by lantern light on evenings when the work was done. He learned that she could name every wildflower in the hill country by common name, and most by their Latin classification, information she delivered with the slight air of someone sharing a small private vanity, and he responded to this by beginning to notice wildflowers on his own, which was not something he had previously been inclined to do. The first time he noticed something wild and small and purple growing along the creek bed near the property line of the livery yard, he thought of her. He did not say so, but he noticed the flowers from that day forward, and sometimes when she arrived in the morning he would mention, almost offhandedly, that he had seen Spanish bluebells along the lower fence or Indian paintbrush on the hillside, and she would nod with a small, private smile, and he would store the image of that smile the way he stored all things worth keeping. By March, the boarding side of the livery was generating good business. 3 ranches had brought horses in on regular terms, and 2 more in the area were in conversation. Cora ran the accounts with the same neat, unsparing attention she applied to everything, and at the end of the first full month, she handed Cecil a ledger that was clean and precise, and showed a profit that surprised him favorably. "You have a gift for this," he said, sitting across from her at the small desk in the livery office, a low-ceilinged room barely large enough for 2 chairs and the desk and a shelf of books and supplies. "I have a gift for arithmetic and a strong dislike of disorder," she said. "That is more than enough. It's considerably more than I had before." She looked up from the ledger at him. They were close in the small space, the lantern on the desk making the light intimate and warm, and she felt suddenly and sharply aware of the proximity, of the fact that she had been coming here every morning for 6 weeks and had begun to structure her days around it in ways she had not fully examined. She looked back at the ledger and said, with the careful casualness of a woman being very precise about her footing, "I should have enough for the bank note by mid-April if the boarding income holds." "It'll hold," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She did not know why that particular sentence, quiet and unadorned and said with the specific tone of a man making a promise he intends to keep, did what it did to her. But she felt it low in her chest, that small match flame she'd been carrying since January, burning slightly less tentatively than before. "Cecil," she said, and then stopped. "Cora," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name without the Mrs. before it, and neither of them made a thing of it, but both of them felt the shift. "Thank you," she said, "for the arrangement, for handling it the way you did, for not making it something I had to fight against or around." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was thinking with his full attention. Then he said, "You've fought enough of the world on your own. It struck me as unnecessary to add to that." She looked at him in the lantern light, and she thought that he was a man who saw people actually saw them, and that this was rarer than any jewel the earth had to offer. She thought about the months of work, the mornings in the stable together, the small pieces of their respective lives that they had shared without ceremony or pretense. She thought about loneliness and about what it meant to not be lonely without the absence of aloneness. She said, "I should get the evening feeding done." "I'll help," he said, and stood, and they went back out into the cool spring evening and fed the horses side by side, and the conversation returned to easy and ordinary things, but something between them had moved carefully, with great precision, in a direction that was not ordinary at all. March passed into April. Cora paid the bank note. She sat across from Harlan Voss in the bank on a Thursday morning and placed the money on his desk, and watched him count it and write the receipt. And she took the receipt and folded it with clean, deliberate movements and placed it in the pocket of her coat and stood and said, "I won't need to see you about this particular matter again, Mr. Voss," and he had the grace to look both relieved and slightly awed. She came out of the bank into the bright spring morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. The town was going about its business around her. A wagon went past with a load of lumber. 2 children chased something through the dust. The cottonwood trees along the creek at the edge of town were coming into their spring leaves, pale and trembling and impossibly new. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt, without qualification or complication, all right. She went to the livery. Cecil was in the yard with a gray stallion belonging to the Henderson Ranch, working with the horse in the way he did, patient and deliberate, building understanding rather than demanding compliance. He looked up when she came through the gate and took in her expression. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "Clear." He let out a breath that was slow and quiet and told her more about how he had been feeling about the thing than he had perhaps intended. "Good," he said. "That's good, Cora." She looked at him standing there in the April morning with the gray horse at his shoulder, and she thought, "This is a good man. Not a perfect man, not an easy man, not a man without complications of his own, but a good one in the way that matters most, in the way that holds when the world puts pressure on it." "Are you busy this evening?" she said. He looked at her with that full attention. "No. I have a rather good recipe for a venison stew that I have been making for myself for months, and it is excessively large for one person. I thought you might want to come out to the property for supper." She said this with perfect composure and only the faintest color at the edge of her cheekbones. Cecil Cooper looked at Cora Abbott in the April morning light, and he smiled, a real smile, not the small ones he was careful with, but a full one, warm and unhurried, the smile of a man who has been patient for a long time and does not regret it. "What time?" he said. 6 o'clock. Follow the north fence and you'll see the house." "I know where your house is." She paused. "You do?" "I ride that way sometimes in the evenings." He said it simply, without apology or elaboration, just the clean fact of it. She nodded once, as though this made perfect sense, and it did. He came at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hands and a jar of honey from the general store. Mrs. Hensley had 2 hives and sold the honey, and it was, by the general consensus of Redemption Creek, extraordinarily good. And Cora opened the door and looked at the honey and then at him and said, "You did not need to bring anything." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." He came inside, and the house was small and clean and warm, with the smell of the stew and something else, the smell of books and lamp oil, and the particular domestic scent of a space that is lived in by someone who keeps things with care. There were 3 books on the shelf above the fireplace. There were wildflowers in a tin cup on the table. There was a quilt over the back of the single chair by the fire that he recognized as serious handiwork, the kind of stitching that takes months. "Did you make that?" he said, nodding at the quilt. "My mother made it," Cora said, from the stove. "She sent it with me when Thomas and I came west, said I would need something to remember that beauty is not merely a luxury." He stood for a moment looking at the quilt, at the precision of the stitching, the deep blues and reds of the fabric pieces. "She was right," he said. "They ate the stew with cornbread and the honey on the side, and they talked for 3 hours. Talked the way 2 people talk when they have been being careful with each other for a significant amount of time, and have finally, in the warmth and privacy of an actual table with actual food between them, decided to stop being quite so careful." Cecil talked about his father's blacksmith shop, and how he had spent entire summers at the anvil as a boy, and how the rhythm of iron work, the heating and the striking and the cooling, had given him his first real sense that some things in life require patience rather than force. Cora talked about the night Thomas died, which she had not talked about to anyone, had not known she was ready to talk about, until she began speaking and found the words already there, shaped by all the months she had been carrying them alone. He listened to her the way he did everything, with complete attention, without rushing toward the end of it, without offering consolation before it was warranted. When she finished speaking, he said, "You have carried that by yourself for a long time." "I did not have anyone to carry it with," she said, and then, meeting his eyes, "until recently." The fire had burned low while they talked. The lantern was warm and soft. The Texas night was quiet around the small house, the kind of quiet that is alive and present rather than empty. Cora was looking at him with something in her eyes that was steady and clear and without pretense, and Cecil was looking back at her in the same way, and the space between them was very small and full of everything that had been building since December and before. "I should go," he said, without moving. "You should," she agreed, without moving either. And then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she looked down at their hands together and then up at his face, and she turned her hand palm up beneath his, and they sat like that for a moment, just the warmth of that, just the simplest possible version of one person reaching toward another and finding them there. "Good night, Cora," he said. "Good night, Cecil," she said. He rode home in the spring dark, and she cleaned up the supper things and went to bed, and neither of them slept particularly well, which they would later acknowledge to each other with amusement, and something warmer than amusement. Spring in the Texas Hill Country in 1879 was extravagant. The bluebonnets came up across the meadows in great purple-blue sheets, and the Indian paintbrush was shocking red against the new green of the pastures, and the hills above Redemption Creek rolled away in every direction with that particular beauty that the country offered without apology, as though it knew what it had put people through, and was making a gesture of compensation. Cecil and Cora saw the spring arrive together. He had taken to riding out to the property on Saturday evenings for supper, and she had taken to arriving at the livery on certain Sunday mornings when she had no mending to deliver, not for work, but simply to drink coffee in the office and read while he worked in the yard, and they moved around each other with an ease that people in Redemption Creek began to notice and remark upon with the particular interest that small towns bring to the romantic arrangements of their inhabitants. Mrs. Hensley at the general store was enthusiastically in favor. Sheriff Briggs, who liked Cecil and had always thought Cora Abbott was one of the more capable people in the county, considered it none of his business but was privately pleased. Dr. Hawthorne said he thought it was sensible. The Reverend at the First Baptist Church, when consulted by Mrs. Hensley on the theological dimensions of a widow remarrying, was supportive and said that God had not created human beings to be alone. Garrett's people came in April. A man named Patterson arrived at the Abbott property on a Wednesday afternoon, well-dressed in the way that money from elsewhere tends to be well-dressed in small Texas towns, and made a reasonable offer on the land. Cora stood on her porch with her arms crossed and her gray eyes steady, and she said, "Thank you for coming all this way, Mr. Patterson. My land is not for sale." Patterson made the offer larger. "I heard you the first time," Cora said. "The answer remains the same." Patterson looked around the property, the winter wheat in the south field coming in strong, the repaired fence line, the vegetable garden already laid in for spring, with the expression of a man recalculating his approach. "Mrs. Abbott, the Garrett organization is offering considerably above market, Mr. Patterson," she said, and her voice was even and clear as spring water. "I buried my husband in that field behind the barn. I broke this land myself, and I have fed myself from it for 18 months without assistance from any person or organization. I do not have a price for that. Now I have asked you politely twice, and I would like to ask you once more, please, to get back on your horse and continue your way." Patterson got back on his horse. The Garrett organization did not send anyone again. She told Cecil about it that Saturday, sitting on the porch after supper in the warm April evening. The hills spread away purple and gold in the fading light. He listened, and when she finished he said, "You are the most formidable person I have ever encountered in any context." She looked at him with a slight frown that was not truly a frown. "I was simply being clear. You were simply being yourself," he said, "which amounts to the same thing in your case." And he said it with such undisguised admiration that the frown resolved into something else entirely, something that lifted the corners of her mouth and warmed the gray of her eyes. They sat quietly for a little while in the evening, side by side on the porch, the air smelling of fresh grass and wood smoke. The horses were settled for the night in the pasture below the house, moving in the long shadows, and the first stars were beginning to come out above the line of the hills. It was the kind of evening that seemed specifically designed to make it harder than usual to be sensible about things. "Cecil," she said. "Cora," he said. And she laughed that real laugh, the sharp, genuine one, and turned toward him on the porch, and he turned toward her, and the distance between them was exactly the distance it had been all spring, that careful, considered distance, and she crossed it first. She moved toward him with the deliberate certainty of a woman who has thought about something thoroughly and has decided, and she kissed him, simple and direct and warm, and his hand came up to her face with a gentleness that was its own kind of answer. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no storm breaking or violin music. There was the porch and the evening light and the sound of the horses and the first stars, and two people who had found each other through the simple, persistent medium of honesty and work and attention, finally arriving at the thing they had both been moving toward for months. When they separated, she looked at him in the fading light. His expression was open in a way she had not seen before. The composed, observant face was still there beneath it, but something had relaxed that she hadn't known was held. "I have been wanting to do that since January," she said. "I have been wanting to do that since I watched you lead your horse into my yard in December," he said, which I did not say because it seemed entirely too soon. It was entirely too soon. "Yes, and now it isn't." "No," she agreed, "now it isn't." They sat together on the porch until the night had fully arrived and the stars were thick and bright above the hill country, and they talked and they were silent and they talked again. And somewhere in the middle of all of it his arm came around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and it was the first time in a very long time that Cora Abbott had leaned on anything. She did not experience it as a diminishment. She experienced it as the particular luxury of a person who has proven, definitively and at considerable personal cost, that they do not need to lean, and who can therefore choose to, when and with whom they decide. Spring passed into summer. The days were long and golden and brutal with heat the way only a Texas summer can be brutal, the kind of heat that has weight to it, that presses down from the sky and up from the red earth and meets you from every direction at once. They worked through it, both of them, the livery and the land both demanding what they demanded, and they moved through the summer together in the way that people move through things together when they have decided on each other. Cecil came to the property 3 evenings a week now, and on Sundays they often rode out together across the hill country, following the creek beds where the shade was deep and the water still ran despite the heat. And Cora would name the plants and Cecil would watch her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of profound affection, careful and warm and entirely attentive. One afternoon in July, they were down by the lower creek in the cottonwood shade and Cecil was watching the water and he said without looking at her, "I would like to ask you something important." "Ask it," she said. He looked at her then. He had rehearsed this, she could tell, had thought carefully about how to say it, but what came out was simply and straightforwardly what he meant. "I want to marry you. I want to spend the rest of whatever time I have left being the person who knows you best, and has the honor of watching you do everything you do. And I am asking you rather than telling you because you are Cora Abbott and you have never done anything you didn't decide to do yourself, and I would not want you to start now." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him in the summer shade by the creek. A bird was singing somewhere up in the cottonwoods. The water moved over the stones. "That was beautifully said," she told him. "I meant every word of it. I know you did." She was looking at him steadily, her gray eyes clear and warm. "Cecil, I spent 2 years building a life that could sustain itself without anyone else in it. I did that because I had to, and I do not regret it. But building something that can stand alone and wanting it to stand alone are 2 different things." She paused. "I love you. I think I have loved you since you looked at my horse first and then at me in the yard that first morning." "Is that a yes?" he said, and there was something young in his voice, something that made her smile with her whole face. "That is a yes," she said. He took her face in both his hands and kissed her in the cottonwood shade, while the summer creek ran past them. And above them the bird was still singing, and the afternoon held still for just a moment around them, the way moments of real happiness sometimes do. They were married in September of 1879, 1 year after Cora had stood over Thomas Abbott's grave in the hard earth, and decided she would not ask for help again. The Reverend conducted the ceremony in the church, and Mrs. Hensley cried, and Dr. Hawthorne said afterward that he was not prone to sentiment, but the whole business had been quite affecting. Sheriff Briggs shook Cecil's hand with the expression of a man, confirming something he had always expected. Miss Farnworth, the schoolteacher, told Cora she was an inspiration to the young women of the county, to which Cora said she hoped the young women of the county had enough sense to follow their own particular paths and not anyone else's. The reception was held in the livery yard, which Cecil had cleaned and strung with lanterns, and the whole town came, or most of it, because in a town of 300 people a good wedding is a communal event, and no one pretends otherwise. There was music from a fiddle player named Jacobs who was extraordinary when he had not been drinking and acceptable when he had, and on this occasion he was entirely sober and played for 2 hours without stopping. There was food that half the women of the town had contributed to without being asked. There was dancing on the packed earth of the yard in the lantern light, and Cecil Cooper danced with Cora Abbott with the focused, earnest effort of a man who is not naturally a dancer, but has decided that this is worth the attempt, and Cora danced with a grace that suggested she had once been taught properly and had retained it, and they were both laughing by the 3rd song, and the sight of them together, the serious, steady man and the self-possessed, enduring woman, made several of the older women in Redemption Creek Feel a specific emotion that resists simple naming. After the dancing, after the food and the toasting and the general community warmth had wound itself down, and the lanterns had been let to burn low, and the last guests had gone home full of goodwill, Cecil and Cora stood together in the empty livery yard under the full September moon, and the night was warm and soft and smelled of hay and late summer flowers, and she leaned into his side with her head against his shoulder, and they were entirely quiet together. "Is it what you wanted?" he said. "The wedding, it was better," she said. "I didn't want a fuss, but I'm glad there was one." "I'm glad you exist," he said simply, "in the general way of things." She tilted her head up to look at him in the moonlight, and he looked back at her, and they were both quiet again, and the quietness was complete. They moved Cora's things to the livery house, a modest but well-built structure at the back of the property that Cecil had been living in and which he had spent the preceding month expanding, adding a proper sleeping room and a larger kitchen, because he was a man who prepared for things before they happened. Cora brought her books, her mother's quilt, her mending tools, her seed stock for the vegetable garden, and the 2 mares and the mule. The buckskin mare whinnied at the unfamiliar surroundings and then settled, because she had always been a sensible horse. Cora kept the 40 acres. She hired a young man named Amos Davies who had come to Redemption Creek looking for work, a serious and capable 18-year-old from a farming family who had been left without prospects when his own family's land had been sold. She paid him a fair wage and gave him the use of the house, and he worked the winter wheat and the spring planting with the same thoroughness she had applied to it herself. And the land continued to generate what it had always generated, not wealth, but sustenance and the particular dignity of a thing cared for. The livery business grew through the autumn. The boarding side doubled, and Cecil took on a young apprentice for the shoeing work, a boy of 16 named Marcus who had an instinctive way with horses. Cora ran the accounts and handled the correspondence with the ranch owners who were their primary clients, and occasionally rode out to the Henderson and Webb ranches herself to discuss arrangements, which the ranchers respected even if some of them found it initially startling, being accustomed to conducting such discussions with men. The Henderson wife, a formidable woman named Beatrice who had been managing her family's enterprise for 20 years in her husband's frequent absences, told Cora over coffee one afternoon that she was the most well-organized woman she had encountered in the county. "My husband used to say I had a gift for order," Cora said. "What he meant was that I could not abide chaos. I think those are different things, but the practical result is the same." Beatrice Henderson laughed and said she thought Cora Abbott Cooper, she corrected herself with a slight smile, was going to do very well in the hill country. "I always have," Cora said, without arrogance, simply as a woman stating a known fact. Winter of 1879 was mild by Texas standards, which meant it was merely cold rather than the kind of cold that drives nails into the earth, and they settled into the livery house with the deep contentment of 2 people who have found the right arrangement after a significant period of less right ones. Cecil learned that Cora read late into the night when she was thinking hard about something, and that the proper response to this was to leave a lamp for her rather than ask her what she was thinking, because she would tell him when she had thought it through. Cora learned that Cecil had a persistent habit of leaving his boots near the door rather than inside it, which she found mildly exasperating until one icy morning when she pulled them on herself to check the horses in a hurry, and found them warm and ready, and realized that he left them there for her. He cooked on the evenings she was deep in accounts or mending. She planted a kitchen garden that was absurdly productive by the following spring. He built her a proper bookshelf, because the books had begun to occupy surface areas in a way that he found charming but she found disorderly. She organized the livery accounts into a ledger system that was so clear and efficient that when Marcus, the apprentice, needed to look something up one afternoon, he found the answer in under a minute and told Cecil in genuine amazement that it was the best organized information he had ever seen. "Tell Mrs. Cooper," Cecil said. "It's her work." Marcus did tell her with the earnest admiration of a young person speaking to someone they respect, and Cora received it with characteristic economy. "Thank you, Marcus. Order is a practice, not a talent. Anyone can learn it." In the spring of 1880, Cora realized she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for 3 days before she said anything, not because she was uncertain or afraid, but because it was hers first, hers alone, the way the grief of Thomas had been hers alone, the way the paying of the bank note had been hers alone, and she needed to feel the shape of it before she shared it. On the 3rd day, in the early morning before Cecil had risen, she was sitting at the kitchen table in the pale light with a cup of coffee, and he came downstairs and saw her sitting there with that particular look she got when something large was occupying her. He sat across from her without speaking. "We are going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, or not only surprise, but something profound and vulnerable and entirely genuine. "When," he said, "autumn, I think. Dr. Hawthorne would know better." He reached across the table, same as the first time, and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand palm up and held on the way she had then, and they sat with the morning light growing around them. "How do you feel?" he said. "I'm not certain yet," she said honestly. "Large, uncertain." Hopeful, she paused, frightened in a way I do not often allow myself to be. "That is the most frightening kind," he said. "Yes," she looked at him. "Cecil, if something—" "Don't," he said quietly, not dismissively, not with false reassurance, just with the steady certainty of a man who has decided which things he will not entertain, not out of naivety, but out of the understanding that some darknesses are better refused until they actually arrive, if they arrive at all. "Just today," he said. "Just what is today?" She nodded. She was not a woman who required comfort at every juncture, but she required honesty always, and he had given it to her. They told Dr. Hawthorne, who confirmed the timing and was professionally warm about the whole thing, and told Cora she was in excellent health and to eat well and rest sufficiently, to which Cora said she would eat well and rest as circumstances permitted. Hawthorne said the same thing he always said when Cora Abbott Cooper told him she would rest as circumstances permitted, which was nothing, because he had learned. Summer of 1880 was hot and full, and the livery business ran at capacity, and Cora worked through it with the same application she brought to everything, making adjustments as her body required them with the pragmatic acceptance of a woman who understood that physical necessity is simply another form of information to be acted upon appropriately. She was not delicate about her pregnancy, but she was sensible, and Cecil was, in his own careful way, remarkable. He did not hover. He did not treat her as though she had become suddenly fragile. What he did was pay attention in the specific ways that mattered, making sure the water barrel was always full so she didn't have to carry it, taking over the heavier work of the boarding yard without ceremony, being present in the evenings with an attentiveness that was both comfortable and unwavering. He built a rocking chair for the porch, which he presented with such a deliberate lack of ceremony. "I built this in case it's useful," that she sat in it immediately and rocked once and said, "It's perfectly balanced," and he understood that this was high praise. In the last weeks of summer, Cora's mother arrived. This was not entirely expected, though Cora had written to her in Tennessee when she learned she was expecting, and her mother had written back saying she intended to come, and that this was not a question. Her mother's name was Eleanor, and she was 52 years old and had the look of a woman who had made Cora, which was to say she was small and precise and had gray eyes that missed nothing. She arrived by stage from San Antonio, having come on the train from Nashville to San Antonio, and then by stage to Redemption Creek, carrying one large trunk and an expression of someone who has been traveling for a significant time and is not the least bit diminished by it. Cecil met her at the stage depot while Cora waited at home, and Eleanor looked at him in the bright summer light for a moment before she said, "You are Cecil?" "Yes, ma'am. My daughter speaks of you in letters the way she speaks of things she is very sure of, Alina said. She has always been an excellent judge. I try to be worthy of the assessment, he said. Alina considered this. You'll do, she said, which from Cora Abbott was approximately equivalent to a lengthy speech of enthusiastic approval, as Cecil would come to understand. Alina was at the house for 6 weeks, and in that time she and Cora had the particular complicated, warm, necessary conversations that mothers and daughters have when the mother has come from a great distance at a moment of significance. And Cora found that some of the things she had been carrying alone for 2 years, since the beginning of all of it, could be set down with her mother there to hold them, and that the setting down was not weakness but relief. And that relief could be received without apology. Cecil came home one evening in early September to find Cora and Alina on the porch in the cooling evening, Alina sewing and Cora in the rocking chair with her hands at rest for once, and the two women talking in low voices with a naturalness that told him this was how they had always been together, easy and honest, and he stood in the yard for a moment before announcing himself, watching the scene with the full, quiet attention he gave to things that mattered. The child came on the 12th of October, 1880. It was a long labor, and Dr. Hawthorne was present, and Alina was present, and Cecil was outside on the porch for a period of time that felt to him approximately as long as all the previous years of his life combined. And the October night was clear and cold, with a moon so bright it cast actual shadows. And he sat in the rocking chair he had built, and he thought about everything he had ever wanted, and whether he deserved any of it, and concluded that deserving was probably the wrong question. When Dr. Hawthorne came to the door and said, "Mr. Cooper, come in," his voice was tired but his expression was good, and Cecil went in, and Alina met him with the look of a woman who has witnessed something tremendous and is enormously relieved. And there was Cora in the bed, with her hair loose around her face and her eyes exhausted and brilliant, and in her arms was a son, small and red-faced and emphatically present, already exhibiting, Cecil thought, a certain quality of being entirely determined to be exactly what he was. Cecil sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both, and Cora looked at him, and she was more beautiful than he had words for, the beauty of someone who has been through something enormous and come out the other side with all of themselves intact. "A boy," she said. "I see that," he said, his voice rough with the emotion of the last hours. "Thomas," she said. "I would like to call him Thomas after his father, his first father." She looked at Cecil with clear, honest eyes. "It's right," Cecil said immediately. "It's exactly right." She looked at him with an expression that was gratitude and love and the particular recognition of someone seeing another person be exactly who they are at a significant moment. "And James for a middle name," she said. "Thomas James Cooper." Cecil held his son for the first time in the October lamplight, and Alina slipped out of the room, and Dr. Hawthorne followed, and they left the three of them together. And Cora watched Cecil hold the baby with the same focused, careful attention he brought to everything. And she thought that this was the whole of it, this ordinary, extraordinary thing. A man and a child in lamplight, the whole world contracted to the size of one room. "Hello, Thomas," Cecil said quietly. "I intend to be very serious about you." Cora laughed, which woke the baby briefly, who regarded them with the deep, unfocused scrutiny of the newly arrived, and then settled back. Alina stayed another 2 weeks and then returned to Tennessee with the satisfaction of a woman who has seen what she needed to see and found it thoroughly adequate. She told Cecil at the stage depot, as she had told him at the beginning, that he would do. Then she corrected herself. "You do better than do," she said. "You are what she needed, that is not nothing." "She is what I needed too," he said. Alina patted his arm and got on the stage. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the first winter that Cora Abbott Cooper had not been alone, and she found that winter was a different experience when shared. Not easier in all the practical senses, because a newborn makes life neither easier nor simpler regardless of what else is happening, but different in the essential quality of it. The dark mornings and the cold evenings and the particular smallness of the world in winter were no longer just things to be endured but a kind of intimacy, a shared pocket of warmth against the season. Thomas James Cooper grew in the way of healthy, determined infants steadily and with consistent demands, and by the spring, a quality of focused observation when awake that made both his parents say, independently and on separate occasions, that he seemed to be paying extremely close attention. "He gets that from you," Cecil said one evening. "He gets it from both of us," Cora said. "You look at things harder than anyone I have ever met. You simply do it more quietly." Cecil considered this. That might be accurate. Spring of 1880 brought the bluebonnets back across the hills, and Thomas saw them for the first time at 6 months old from the saddle in front of his mother on the buckskin mare. Cora had resumed riding in the spring with the same practical resumption she applied to all things, and his reaction to the great purple-blue fields was to reach both arms toward them with an expression of concentrated desire. "Bluebonnet," Cora said to him, "Lupinus texensis. Remember that." Thomas made a sound that suggested he was working on it. Cecil, riding alongside on his gray, watched his wife and his son in the spring morning and thought that whatever he had done right in his life, however imprecisely and incompletely he had managed his various years on the earth, something in the accumulation of it had brought him to this specific morning, this specific light, these specific people, and he was grateful with the deep, unhurried gratitude of someone who has learned the difference between luck and grace. He said, "Cora." She turned her head toward him, the baby on her lap, her dark hair loose under her hat brim, her gray eyes warm in the spring light. "I love you," he said, not for the first time. Not for any particular reason other than the morning and the bluebonnets and the fact that it was true. "I love you," she said, simply and completely, the way she said all true things. They rode on through the flowers. The livery continued to grow through 1881. Cecil and Marcus, the apprentice, now 18 and formally employed, handled the shoeing and boarding for 6 ranches in the area. Cora ran the accounts, maintained correspondence, and had developed, through her relationship with Beatrice Henderson and 2 other ranch wives, a kind of informal network of practical intelligence about land, livestock, and business in the region that kept them informed and connected. She also taught Thomas to read, or began to, as he became old enough to sit still long enough, which took somewhat longer than she had anticipated for a child of such evident intelligence. In the summer of 1882, when Thomas was almost 2, Amos Davies came to Cora with a question about expanding the crop rotation on the 40 acres. He had been reading agricultural materials and had thoughts about summer sorghum, and Cora heard him out with full attention, and then said that she thought his reasoning was sound, and that he should implement it on the East Quarter and observe the results before committing further. Amos did so, and the results were favorable, and the exchange established a pattern of consultation and trust that served them both well in the years that followed. Also in the summer of 1882, the question of the schoolhouse came up. The school in Redemption Creek had been operating in the back room of Miss Farnworth's home for years, which was inadequate on every dimension, and there had been discussions about building a proper school for nearly as long. The discussions had never progressed to action. Cecil attended one of the town meetings on the subject, and came home and told Cora that the obstacle was the same obstacle most good ideas encountered, which was money and the coordination of people who agreed on the goal, but not on the means. Cora thought about this for a week. Then she wrote a letter to Beatrice Henderson and another to the 2 other ranch wives she knew, and she proposed a building committee with a specific plan and a specific timeline, and a specific list of who would contribute what. The letter was clear and direct and anticipated most of the obvious objections. Within a month, the building committee had its funding. By October, the school had its foundation. By the following spring, Miss Farnworth had a proper schoolroom with a proper stove and proper windows and desks enough for 30 children. When asked how she had managed to accomplish in 2 months what the town had been attempting for years, Cora said, I asked the people who had the resources and explained clearly why they would benefit from using them. It is not complicated. She paused. Most things that seem complicated are not complicated. They simply require someone willing to proceed past the appearance of complexity. Miss Farnworth said this was the most useful thing anyone had said about civic organization in years, and asked if she could write it down. "It's not original," Cora said. "My mother used to say something similar. The winter of 1882 was hard. Blue northers came down from the panhandle in waves, and the temperature dropped in ways that challenged even the hill country's mild winter reputation. They were prepared. They were always prepared, the two of them, in the way that people who have each spent significant time learning to account for the worst prepare for winters. And they got through it with full firewood and well-stocked cellars, and the growing, warm domestic life of the livery house, which now included Thomas at 2 years old, who had opinions about everything, including the arrangement of his toys and the appropriate time for the day to begin, which was earlier than both his parents preferred. One January evening, after Thomas had finally been settled and the house was quiet with only the fire and the wind outside and the lamp between them on the table, Cecil said, "What do you think about another child?" Cora looked at him across the lamp. "I have been thinking about it," she said. "I know you have the look, the problem-solving look, the considering something significant look," he smiled, "which is slightly different." She was quiet for a moment, her hands around her cup. "I think yes," she said. "If it comes, yes, but not yet pursued. I think I want Thomas a little older and more certain before we divide the attention." He nodded. "That seems right. You agree." "I trust your reasoning, I always do." She looked at him warmly. "You are the most uncomplicated person to be married to," she said. "I mean that as extraordinary praise." "Uncomplicated or simple," he said, slightly wary. "They are not the same thing at all," she said firmly. "Uncomplicated means clear. It means you say what you mean and mean what you say, and your interior life matches your exterior presentation. That is rarer than diamonds and twice as valuable." She paused. "Simple would mean the opposite of complex thought, which is entirely not what you are. You are the most thoroughly thinking person I know, Cecil. You simply do your thinking carefully and without making theater of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "How is it," he said, "that you consistently find the exact right word for every single thing?" "Years of practice," she said, "and a mother who made me read everything twice." He laughed, and she did too, and the January night was cold outside and warm inside, and they were safe and together and well, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the whole abundance of a life. Spring of 1883 was when Marcus the apprentice announced he was getting married to a young woman named Clara, who had come to Redemption Creek with her family the previous summer. It was also when Amos Davies, out at the 40 acres, successfully implemented the full sorghum rotation and produced a yield that made Cora look at the numbers with something very close to delight. She rode out to the property on a bright March morning and walked the east field with Amos and said, "This is excellent work. I mean that completely." Amos, who was 21 now and had grown from a serious youth to a serious young man with the particular dignity of someone who has found meaningful work, said quietly, "It's your land, Mrs. Cooper. I just tend it." "You do more than tend it," she said. "You think about it. There's a difference." She was thinking about this on the ride home, the difference between tending and thinking, between surviving and building. When she came over the rise above Redemption Creek and saw the town spread below her in the March morning, the cottonwoods green along the creek, the church steeple, the main street, the livery at the south end with its yard and its movement of horses. She had come to this place with Thomas 3 years before her husband died, and she had been broken open by grief and closed herself back up with the materials available, and she had made a life here that was entirely, specifically hers. And then she had made a life here that was also, entirely and specifically, shared. And the shared life had not diminished the first one. It had extended it. That was the thing she would not have known before she knew it, the thing you cannot explain to someone who has not arrived at it themselves. She rode down into Redemption Creek in the March morning and turned toward the livery and heard, as she came through the gate, Thomas shouting with great enthusiasm about something involving the gray horse, and Cecil's low voice responding with the infinite patience he brought to all dealings with their son, and she dismounted and went around the corner and found them. Cecil holding Thomas on the fence rail, Thomas with both small hands on the gray's neck, utterly focused and entirely fearless. "He has no fear," Cecil said, looking up at her. "Of course he doesn't," Cora said, coming to stand beside them. "He doesn't know yet that there's anything to be afraid of." "Horses," Thomas said with authority. "Yes," Cora agreed. "Horses, very good." Cecil looked at her over their son's head, a look that was private and warm and entire, and she looked back at him the same way. By summer of 1883, Cora found she was expecting again. She sat with it for 3 days as before, and then told Cecil at the kitchen table in the morning light, and his response was the same as the first time, that profound, genuine, slightly vulnerable stillness. And then he said, "Thomas will be pleased." "Thomas is 3, Cora said. "He will be pleased until the child is actually here and claims any portion of his considerable domain." Cecil laughed. "We'll manage it." "We will," she agreed. Dr. Hawthorne, informed of the pregnancy, said that Cora was in excellent health and to rest sufficiently, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been told not to waste his breath and knows it. The child came in February of 1884, a daughter this time, whom they named Eleanor Grace Cooper after both their mothers, Eleanor for Cora's mother in Tennessee, and Grace for Cecil's mother, who had died when he was 12, and who he had spoken of on certain evenings with a quiet love that was the most private thing about him. Eleanor Grace was nothing like Thomas in temperament, which was exactly the surprise and delight of it. Where Thomas was focused and deliberate, Eleanor Grace was effusive and certain, conducting her infancy with a volume and determination that made everyone in the household slightly breathless. Thomas, when introduced to her, stared at her for a long moment and then said, "Loud," which was accurate. He then, over the following weeks, appointed himself her primary protector and began bringing her various objects he considered significant: a smooth stone, a dried flower, one of Cora's smaller books, as though building her a collection. Cora, watching this, felt something so large and warm it was almost unwieldy. Eleanor Abbott arrived from Tennessee when Eleanor Grace was a month old, because Eleanor Abbott was not a woman who missed significant events in her daughter's life if she could help it, and spent 3 weeks with them, sleeping in the room beside Thomas and rising each morning before everyone else to start the coffee, and stand on the porch in the early light looking out at the hill country with the expression of someone admiring something they respect. On the last evening before Eleanor returned to Tennessee, she and Cora sat on the porch together in the February cold with their coats and their coffee, and Eleanor said, "You are happy." "I am," Cora said. "Your father would have wanted this for you." Cora looked out at the hills. Her father had died years before Thomas Abbott, before any of this. "I know," she said. "I think he would have liked Cecil." "Everyone likes Cecil," Eleanor said. "He is impossible not to like. What I mean is that your father would have respected him, which is different and more significant." "Yes," Cora said, "it is." They were quiet for a moment. The night air was cold and clean. Somewhere down in the town a dog was barking and then stopped. "I did not know," Cora said, "when I buried Thomas, that first Thomas. I did not know that anything would follow that was worth the word life rather than just the word continuation." Eleanor looked at her daughter. "And now I know that everything followed, all of this, all of them." She paused. "It did not diminish the grief. I still carry it, I always will. But it is its own thing and this is its own thing, and they exist together without canceling each other out." Eleanor put her arm around Cora's shoulders. Cora leaned into her mother, which was the original version of learning to lean, and they sat in the cold together and were quiet, and were the two women they were, complete and complicated and entirely each other's. Cecil came to the door and looked out at them and said, "It's cold. Come inside." And his voice was warm with concern, and Alina said something in response that made Cora smile, and they went inside. Alina went home the next day, and she went home knowing that everything that needed to be all right was all right, which is the best thing a mother can know. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not make for dramatic telling but make for a good life, which is the more important achievement. The livery continued to be the steady foundation of their income. Cora's 40 acres became, under Amos Davies' thoughtful management and her own consistent oversight, a genuinely productive small farm that she was proud of in the specific way she was proud of things. Quietly, privately, with full acknowledgement of everything it had cost. Thomas grew up to be exactly the person his character had suggested at age 3, focused, deliberate, with the observational quality of his father and the precision of his mother, and a way with horses that exceeded even Cecil's considerable skill. He began working seriously at the livery at 12, and at 15 had opinions about equine management that the neighboring ranchers were beginning to quietly seek out, which made Cecil say with significant understatement, "He'll be all right, I think." Alina Grace grew up to be the opposite kind of person, which is to say the kind that fills every room she enters with a volume and warmth that makes other people feel more present. She had Cora's gray eyes and Cecil's dark hair and her own particular personality that was entirely neither of them, which was the right and natural way of things. She made friends with comprehensive enthusiasm. She learned to read voraciously from her mother and to listen carefully from her father, and she combined these skills with such effectiveness that Miss Farnworth, still teaching, because the new schoolroom had revived her dedication entirely, said Ellie Cooper was the most capable student she had had in 20 years. Redemption Creek grew in those years. By the mid-1880s, it had reached 500 people, with a second general store and a second doctor, and a telegraph office that connected the town to the wider world, with an immediacy that still occasionally startled people who had grown up without it. New families arrived, drawn by land and opportunity, and Cecil and Cora Cooper were by that point simply a part of the fabric of the place, known, established, trusted, the kind of people that new arrivals are pointed toward when they need someone reliable. In the fall of 1886, when Thomas was 6 years old, the elder one, the first Thomas, the one made of grief and memory, Cora rode out to the old property on an October afternoon and stood at the grave behind the barn with the autumn light coming down through the sky and the smell of approaching rain in the air, and she talked for a while to the crooked wooden cross, which Amos had replaced some years ago with a proper stone marker that she had paid for in Redemption Creek, and which read Thomas James Abbott, husband and dreamer, 1845–1878. She talked about the children. She told him about Thomas James Cooper, who carried his name and some of his character, and about Alina Grace, who was entirely herself. She told him about the 40 acres, which were productive and cared for. She told him about Cecil, about who he was and what he had given her, speaking honestly and without guilt because she had long ago understood that love is not a finite resource that diminishes with use, that you do not love less of one person by loving fully another. She said, "You brought me here. That was the gift. You brought me to this land and this place, and even in the way you left me you gave me something. You gave me the proof that I could stand. I did not know I could stand until you were gone. I would not have known it any other way." She paused. "I am grateful for all of it, even the parts that were terrible." She stood there for a while with the wind in the dry grass and the October sky wide and blue above her. Then she straightened and walked back to her horse and rode home. Cecil was on the porch when she arrived, the elder Thomas at his feet with a wooden horse he had been carving for the boy, Ellie inside making her emphatic presence known through the window by the sounds of conversation with apparently herself. He looked up when she came into the yard and took in her face with that full attention. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, meaning it entirely. She dismounted and handed the mare's reins to young Thomas, who took them with the serious professionalism of a 6-year-old who considers horses his primary domain. And she climbed the porch steps and sat beside Cecil and leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her and they watched the afternoon light move across the hill country hills and listened to their daughter's enthusiastic monologue from inside the house. "Cecil," she said. "Cora," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for looking and not looking away." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when something mattered enough to respond to carefully. Then he said, "You made it easy. You showed me everything you were from the beginning. All I had to do was pay attention." "Most people don't," she said. "Most people aren't paying attention to the right things." He held her closer. "I was looking for something worth attending to. You were the most worth attending to thing I had ever found." She tilted her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the hills and the wind and the small sounds of their life around them. Ellie had apparently resolved her conversation with herself and come out the back door. They could hear her calling to Thomas in the yard, the quick, bright sound of it. Horses moved in the pasture. The sky above the hill country was that deep, serious blue that comes in October afternoons, the blue that means the season is turning and the world is going about its ancient business of change and renewal. "I was frightened," Cora said. "In those first months, after Thomas died, I did not show it to anyone, but I was frightened all the way down." "I know," he said. "I could see it, underneath the other thing." "What other thing?" "The strength, the particular way you carried yourself." He paused, finding the words. "You wore it like something you had earned in a very dark place. Like armor, but not armor exactly, more like something built rather than something put on. I saw it the first time you walked into my yard with that horse, and I thought, that woman has been through something and come out the other side still herself. That's the rarest thing there is." She was quiet for a long time after that. "You saw it in the light," she said finally. "Everyone else looked away from it. They didn't know what to do with it, with a woman who had been broken and rebuilt herself. You looked straight at it." "How could I look away from it?" he said. "It was the most important thing about you." "Not the most important," she said, "but the first thing. The thing that made the rest possible." "Yes," he said, "the thing that made the rest possible." Ellie came tearing around the corner of the house at that moment with Thomas in pursuit, and both of them thundered up the porch steps and crashed into their parents with the specific energy of children who have unlimited confidence in being caught. And Cecil caught them both without dropping Cora, which she privately found impressive. And there was a period of the glorious, noisy chaos that had replaced the quiet of the livery house and improved it immeasurably. That evening after supper, after the children were settled and the dishes done and the lamps turned low, Cora and Cecil sat at the kitchen table as they had sat countless evenings before, the way people who have chosen each other sit together, in the ease and warmth of that choosing. She had her book open but was not reading it. He had his coffee and was looking out the window at the dark hills. "I was thinking," he said, "about expanding the livery yard. Taking on the property to the east. Old Hammond was asking about buyers." Cora considered this with the focused practicality she brought to all questions of land and money. "How much is he asking?" Cecil told her. She thought about it. "It's fair," she said. "With the boarding income at the level it's running, we could manage it by spring. What's the purpose of the expansion?" "A separate breaking yard," he said. "Marcus has been talking about training work. He's good with the young horses and there's demand for it from the Webb Ranch and the Kimball outfit." "Marcus deserves his own operation if he's going to build one," Cora said. "Have you spoken to him about a partnership arrangement?" Cecil looked at her. "I was going to, yes." "You've been thinking about it too?" "I've been watching him for 3 years. He's ready. A partnership would serve him better than a wage and serve us better than a wage arrangement in the long term." "I thought you'd say something like that." "You thought I'd say that because it's correct," she said. "You are almost never not correct," he said. "It is one of your more remarkable qualities and occasionally the mildest challenge." She looked at him over the book she was not reading. "Occasionally the mildest challenge," she repeated. "The very mildest." He was entirely straight-faced. She kicked his boot under the table, which she had never in her life done to another human being before Cecil Cooper, and he caught her foot between his and held it there, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table in the low lamplight, and it was perfectly and entirely all right, all of it, the whole of the life they had built together in this town in the Texas Hill Country in the years after the darkness and through the light. Marcus and Cora and Cecil worked out the partnership arrangement over the following weeks, careful and fair, and Marcus brought it home to Clara with shining eyes, and Clara came to Cora the next day and said, with the directness of someone who has been thinking carefully about how to say a thing, "You have changed our lives, and I want you to know I know it." "Marcus changed his own life," Cora said. "He did the work. We simply had the good sense to recognize it." "That is a generous way to say it," Clara said. "It is an accurate way to say it," Cora said, "which in my experience is the best kind of generosity." She was 40 years old in 1892 when she sat on the porch on a spring evening and watched Thomas, who was 12 now and already taller than her, practice with the rope in the yard the way Cecil had taught him, the loop rising and falling with the same particular patience his father brought to all technical things. Ellie was somewhere in the house reading. She had become almost as ferocious about books as Cora, which Cora considered a significant achievement of parenthood. Cecil was in the livery. The 40 acres were producing well. The livery was the best operation in the county. Redemption Creek was a proper town. The school that Cora had organized the funding for had graduated 2 classes of children who would go on to do various things in various places, some of which would filter back to her in the years ahead in the form of letters and news, because the teachers and students of Redemption Creek did not forget who had built them a proper place to learn. She was 40 years old, and she was sitting in the rocking chair Cecil had built in 1880, and she was looking at her son in the evening light and the hills beyond him, and the life she was in was so entirely and specifically what she had made of it. The choices and the griefs and the work and the love, all of it woven together into something that was not simple and not unearned, and not anything other than genuinely, permanently, specifically hers. Cecil came out of the livery and walked across the yard and came up the porch steps and sat beside her, as he always did, as she always expected, as she had been expecting for years now and never taken for granted. He had a coffee cup in each hand and gave her one, and she took it, and they sat and watched Thomas with the rope in the evening. "He's going to be better than you," Cora said, meaning the roping. "He already is," Cecil said, without any apparent disturbance about this. "He's better with the horses, too. By the time he's 20, he'll run the whole operation better than I ever did. And you're all right with that. It's the point," he said. "Isn't it, that he's better?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly the point." The evening light was gold on the hills, the particular gold of a Texas spring evening that suggests the world has decided, at least for this moment, to be as generous as it is capable of being. The rocking chair was steady beneath her. The coffee was warm in her hands. Her son was practicing his rope in the yard and would one day know more about horses than any man in the county, and her daughter was somewhere inside preparing to devour another book, and her husband was beside her in the evening, as he had been for 11 years now, steady and attentive, and entirely who he was. Cora Abbott Cooper had been many things in her 40 years on the earth. She had been a daughter and a student and a wife and a widow, and a woman alone on 40 acres who buried her own husband with a rusted shovel. She had been a businesswoman and an account keeper and a community organizer and a mother and a partner, and she had been, for a particular December through the following spring, and for every year after, loved. Properly, attentively, without diminishment, loved. She had worn her strength like something she had earned in the dark. She had earned it there, in all the dark places, the empty nights and the hard earth and the long work and the grief that does not announce itself as grief, but simply as the persistent weight of going on without. She had built the strength from those materials and carried it into the light, and she had not tried to hide it or soften it or make it more comfortable for people who found it inconvenient. And Cecil Cooper had seen it, in the light, exactly as it was, and had not looked away. Had looked at it with the full attention he brought to everything important. Had seen not an obstacle or an anomaly, but the most interesting and admirable thing he had ever encountered, had moved toward it rather than around it, and had spent 11 years and counting proving, in the daily and practical and profound way that love is actually proved, that seeing someone clearly is the beginning and the sustaining thing. The evening settled around them. Thomas called something from the yard that Cecil answered. Ellie appeared in the doorway behind them with a book and a question about supper, and Cora answered, and she disappeared again. The first star came out above the hills, faint and then certain. They were quiet together on the porch, as they had been quiet together on so many porches and so many evenings, and the quietness was full of everything that had passed and everything that was present and everything that was still coming, all the ordinary, extraordinary days ahead of them, all the continued unfolding of the life they had made. "Cecil," she said. "Cora," he said. And there was nothing else that needed saying, and they both knew it. And they sat together in the last of the evening light, while the Texas Hill Country moved through its ancient and beautiful business all around them, and they were home.